Hello, this is Instructor Deb Wallace, and this is just a video lecture of the first class for 1954 to present Black experience. We're going to go ahead and get started. First, just so we know what's going to happen, this is just a brief overview of African American history up until 1954. Here are a few key terms that I thought would be important. Jim Crow. This term was coined first in 1841 in Massachusetts. It was initially used to talk about the part of the train where African Americans or Black people rode, so they rode separately from the whites. It then became a term to describe a dance that was used to ridicule Black people, and then later on it became a phrase that embodied separate but equal. Terror law was a law that was established in 1923 in Texas, and this law came about really in response to the victories that African Americans had gained with political mobilization, with a couple of Supreme Court cases. And so in Texas, in order to stop African Americans from participating in the democratic process, this law was put into place. A paradigm, as we talked about in the first class, or we should have discussed in the first class, is a theory or model, right? It's a concept. And in our first class, we talked about three different theories: the assimilationist, integrationist, which is associated with W.E.B. Du Bois, the segregationist, accommodationist, which is associated with Booker T. Washington, and then the nationalist, separatist, which is associated with Marcus Garvey, and then I believe Henry Highland Garnet. The Industrial Revolution is was a movement, but also it was an economic base. The movement swept through Europe and into the United States during the early 18th, late 17th, early 18th century. And so that movement, which became the economic base here in the United States, really was a factor also in what was happening in the United States in the 1800s as we got closer and closer to the Civil War. So there were two economic bases that were in contention with one another: agriculture and the Industrial Revolution. And so, as we talk a little bit more about what happened in the United States, the Industrial Revolution played a factor in what turned out to be the Civil War. The transatlantic slave trade, also known as the Middle Passage, is the route by which Europeans took to capture and trade slaves. So that route included traveling down the west coast of Europe, down the west coast of Western Africa, south towards West Indies, and then towards South America, and then up the east coast of the United States, which we call the modern day United States, and then across back to Europe. So where have African Americans been? So let's talk about traveling from Africa to the New World. So when we talk about the Black experience class primarily focuses on African Americans here in the United States and their plight for equality, for freedom, for fairness, to be recognized for their contributions. However, prior to coming to the United States, Africans were very industrialized, they were highly civilized, they were very much developed. So when we talk about the Black experience, we can't talk about the Black experience in a vacuum and just in the United States without acknowledging that many of Black Americans' ancestors did have roots in Africa. If you've taken the first section of the course from 1619 all the way through 1877, you would have known that there were several kingdoms that were established in Africa. You would know that Africa was landlocked. It was called the Dark Land by Europeans. It was called the Dark Continent, actually, because they did not have any knowledge of the people who were on the continent of Africa. Also, if you look at a map of Africa, you'll notice that the top half of Africa is a third of Africa is desert. And so you have a lot of people who just had not ventured into Africa from Europe. So the information about the people, the culture, how they lived, their governing systems was really unknown. When we talk about Africa, we also talk about their writing system. They had a highly developed writing system. There was a governing system. They had monarchs, what we call Mansas, Mansa Musa, who was one of the richest and wealthiest men in the 1300s, who made a pilgrimage to Mecca. We talk about the Ghanaian kingdom. They had at least 44 kings by the time 300 AD rolled around. We talk about the Africans being blacksmiths and woodsmiths and coppersmiths. So they were very, very, very developed. We talk about Egypt, and Egypt having not just a very well-defined writing system, but they were very skilled in science and in math and knowing how to farm the land. So they were very skilled agriculturalists. They also had a very highly developed sense of religion. So it's important to talk about these things because as we get over to the New World, many of the ties that Africans had to the continent of Africa, when they were taken away from their continent, they had to break and reestablish and reassimilate and acclimate to a new environment. So when we talk about Africans coming to the New World, first, we talk about the Spanish being part of actually Portugal was one of the first sets of Europeans that actually came over, and they pillaged the land. Prince Henry, the navigator, sent his caravels down to West Africa to pillage the land, to look for gold and diamonds. Spain followed, the Dutch followed, Europe. Great Britain was the very last to get in on the slave trade. When we talk about the settling of and the conquering of Africans, when Africans came here to the United States and settled in Jamestown in 1607, initially slavery was not part of the system. The system was based on indentured servanthood. So we have many slaves that were coming here to the United States, and Europeans who were dependent upon these slaves to help them farm the land, to help them survive. And so there was sort of this symbiotic relationship. We don't see the institution of slavery really until the late 1600s. So what happens between 1607 and 1660? What happens is that Africans are able to come, when they arrive here in the United States, they have Christian names. And because they have Christian names, white Europeans do not believe it is right to enslave a Christian brother. And so when they arrive here, they are able to not only work as indentured servants, but they're able to purchase their freedom. As Africans, more and more Africans came over, the sentiment about Africans being seen as citizens began to diminish. There was also the sentiment of them versus us. Also, the change in economic base, the agricultural and economic base went from sugar to rice to indigo to tobacco. And so there was a need to have more hands on deck to harvest this crop. Also, when you talk about needing more hands on deck, typically there was a hierarchy, a social hierarchy. So it was easy to actually have white indentured servants work the land as well as African indentured servants. However, white indentured servants felt that they did not have to work the land and were able to purchase their freedom a lot quicker than African indentured servants. Soon we see that African indentured servants their rights are taken away. So even if they arrive and they convert to Christianity, they are no longer seen as being able to convert to Christianity. They're no longer seen as being able to be indentured servants. Their rights as humans are taken away. So we see what's instituted known as the Black Codes. So this goes from 1600 to about 1710. And this takes away their ability to convert to Christianity, to become indentured servants, to purchase their freedom, to read, to write, what have you. From this point forward, we see just an influx of Africans that are coming over to harvest the land, to work the land. What changes between 1710 and 1770 is that The New World European settlers are also struggling to figure out what their relationship is with Great Britain, as Great Britain sent these settlers over initially to generate revenue and to send revenue back to the motherland. As these settlers continue to establish themselves, as new settlers come over, the question becomes, we really would like to be able to think independently of Great Britain and the church. So there's tension there. The Declaration of Independence, of course, is written. There is a need for troops to be gathered and a military to be established. So you have these Africans who are not seen as human. In fact, they're seen as property. The term that is used is chattel, CHATTEL. So they're seen as property. And so to move from being seen as property to being seen as human requires some forethought there, right? It requires what can I do to get involved so that I can move from this status to at least being seen as human, and then move towards freedom. So George Washington recruits free men who are able to fight in the military against Great Britain. And during the time, he says that he is not recruiting Africans who are free or enslaved. Great Britain sees an opportunity. They send Lord Dunmore over to represent the loyalists. Those are the people who fight for Great Britain. And Lord Dunmore recruits enslaved and free black men. And what Great Britain offers is, not only do they offer these Africans who fight for them citizenship, they offer to pay them and to create a place for them in their society. Of course, George Washington, who is the general at the time, recants his statement and says that he will indeed recruit free black men. As you know, Great Britain and the United States go to war, and the United States wins, and there is this heightened sense of nationalism. After Great Britain loses, and those Africans and African Americans or blacks who fought go back to England, this sort of sense of great nationalism sort of blankets the country. And so there are several Southern slave masters who feel the need to free their slaves because of this great sense of patriotism and nationalism. What happens is that many of these slave masters, under what's called manumission laws, they begin to free their slaves. So during this time, we see a migration of Africans up north and towards the west. And this sentiment of nationalism continues for a while until the cotton gin, which is invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney. So what does the cotton gin do? The cotton gin strengthens the agricultural economic base. The cotton gin requires that twice as many people, twice as much labor to be needed in order to harvest cotton. So we see what's called the Second Middle Passage happens in the United States, where we see a bunch of slaves, a bunch of blacks that are enslaved, re-enslaved. So you have slave masters that are sending bounty hunters up north to force families back down to the South to become slaves again. The 1800s is pretty rough. There is a lot of dismal sentiment because of slavery, because of the cotton gin. There are several slave revolts that happen, and we see a lot of tension there, from Denmark Vesey to Gabriel to Nat Turner. So what happens is that we see that these slave masters are wanting to instill fear, wanting to instill psychological bondage. And so they allow for public showings of hangings of slaves, of beatings of slaves, of torturing of slaves, to establish this fear and to establish this forced loyalty for slaves to be in submission to the system of slavery. Fast forward, Abraham Lincoln comes on the scene. There's tension between not just slave and slave master. There's some tension between those who are in power and the states that are free states versus slave states. So we have the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which there are several states that are part of that Northwest Ordinance, and there are several states that are part of the Missouri Compromise, which is part of the 1850 Compromise. So there are states that are in competition. In order to maintain that balance of free and slave states, there are several states that are not happy with the system because of the abolitionists, right? Let's fast forward and talk about the Civil War. The Civil War happens. Before the Civil War happens, Abraham Lincoln was really pressed to not have a war, so he offered to pay states to slowly move towards emancipation, so that the Civil War did not happen. As we all know, that did not happen. Many states began to secede from the Union, and in order to prevent that, Abraham Lincoln was in a position where he had to make a decision about whether or not to go to war. After the war, we see there are what's called Reconstruction, the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which allowed for African Americans the right to vote, the right for citizenship, and free the slaves, right? So we move towards this model of we're moving towards freedom, we're moving towards equality. There's still barriers that are happening here in the United States, from not just access, but the sentiment that African Americans, that Blacks are not equal. After the Civil War, we see what's called the Great Migration, the Great Exodus, where we see a ton of Africans that move, Blacks that move up toward the north. They're settling in big cities. They're settling in areas where family members have been established. We see in the 1900s, World War I, World War II, and Africans are joining the military to not just for the sake of just being patriotic, but because that is an ensured sense of employment. We find out that just because the need to be patriotic and to show nationalism by joining the military is present does not necessarily mean that African Americans are accepted during this time. It's during World War II that we see more African Americans being promoted. We see more African Americans that are in leadership positions. It's also during this time that we see what's called the Double V campaign, which was started. The Double V campaign focused on fighting the war with communism abroad and fighting the war on racism at home. There are other wars that sort of bring that sort of draw out this racism inequality towards the forefront. Later on, we talk about the Vietnam War. Cassius Clay in the 1960s he does protest this war, and he says that he's not going to fight someone who has never called him a name, and he changes his name to Muhammad Ali and takes on the mantra and changes to the Nation of Islam. He adopts the Nation of Islam. So you'll see that these are some current issues in the Black community, 21st century issues in the African American community. And so you'll notice here that these are some videos that you have the option of watching. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular slide, but I will say that choose 2 of these slides to watch and answer discussion. You can answer discussion question 1 or discussion question 2. in the discussion board, but choose two of these videos to watch, and answer this discussion question. You'll notice that the new Jim Crow, this video discusses the separate, but it's really separate but equal, but it's separate but unequal, as it looks at the mass incarceration of people of color, and specifically Black men. This video focuses on a current issue of HIV, the AIDS epidemic among Black men, and tells a personal story. And this video gives a little highlight of Tim Wise and his talk on racism and police brutality. So choose two videos to watch and then answer the question. So for this slide, what you want to do is go to the link that you see in the slide here and choose one event that you were unaware of and document the event in the discussion board for this slide as well too. Just one event for each. So we talk a little bit about some of the policy changes that I mentioned before. So we talked about the Terrell Law in 1923, which set the stage for the Sweat versus Painter case. And then the Topeka Board of Education. Topeka Board of Education was epic, and it was fundamental because education was the last public venue that was yet to be desegregated. Once education was desegregated, it was then open season for the other parts of public access, public goods and services to be desegregated. So this set the stage for the civil rights movement. So right after the Board of Education, we see that the civil rights movement began to take place in the 1960s. So it's important that you look at other policies that have been established after the 1960s that have had an impact on the African American community. So one of the other policies that have had an impact on African Americans is the Family Assistance Plan, which was under the Nixon administration. And it really was a plan that was developed to help poor families where the heads of households were matriarchs, they were women, they were mothers. And it was Nixon that sort of I say he spearheaded the plan, but he definitely had influence in getting the plan in place. It was actually the plan was actually established after what was known as the Moynihan Report. And so the Moynihan Report really was a report that called attention for national action to the Negro family. And so what that report did was it highlighted the breakdown of the lower class Black family, and the link between the breakdown of the family and juvenile delinquency, and other delinquent behaviors such as drug addiction and poor performance in school. And so it allowed for really the social scientists, the Black social scientists, to highlight what was happening in the Black community and a call to action from those who were decision makers. And so it was Nixon that actually, after reading this report, said we need to move forward and provide some sort of assistance that can sort of combat, or at least move towards combating this issue. So for this discussion question, I want you to think about or look for another policy that has had a negative or positive impact on the African American community. What is the policy and what has the impact been? What was the impact of the policy? I know I have 1950 to present, but that Terrell Law I think is very important because it set the case for what would be, what would be something that blew the hinges off the door, which was the Topeka Board of Education. So you have the option of doing discussion question 1 or discussion question 2. You don't have to do both. You just choose one and answer the question in the discussion board. So this is just an article, a current article that I thought I would tie in to talk a little bit about the statistics of African Americans and cancer. So if you have a chance, I uploaded the article for your reading, but you don't have to read it. But the article really covers a lot of statistics of African Americans and the percentages of African Americans up until 2016 that are diagnosed with cancer and or that have died from cancer. And so generally this article is pretty fascinating because it talked about African Americans generally tend to avoid going to the doctor. Some of it is a disparity with access. Some of it is a disparity with just general health education. But there is a note here that African Americans, the percentages of African Americans dying from cancer has lowered. It was lower in 2016. So the authors predicted that approximately 70,000 would die from cancer, which is actually down, but 189 would be diagnosed. 189,000 would be diagnosed, but 70,000 would actually die, which is down from a couple of years ago where that number was almost double of those who would actually die. So it's interesting because we have a lot more access. And definitely under the Affordable Health Care Act, there's a lot more access to get screened for these type of health concerns. So whether it's cancer, prostate, breast, uterine, whatever, especially if your cancer runs in your family, access to these facilities and these resources are much easier. So I thought this was a very timely article with the fact that we are still dealing with the changes in our new administration and the question of if healthcare is not going to be just affordable but accessible, because both issues are on the table as we speak. So the question is, what are some concerns? What other concerns do African Americans have as far as health? What concerns should African Americans be raising about their health? So as you can see, these are my references for this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at dmw68@zips.uakron.edu, and I look forward to seeing you in class.